You still pay your taxes. The roads are still paved. The grain ships still arrive at the docks, right on schedule. Nobody around you believes anything is wrong. Historians now mark this decade as the beginning of the end. Not a single battle. Not one barbarian at the gates. Just a quiet erosion, decade after decade, that almost nobody in Rome could see while it was happening. You wake up in a city of over 1 million people. Aqueducts carry fresh water for miles. Bathhouses are full. Bread is subsidized. You have lived your whole life believing Rome is eternal. Everyone around you believes it too. That belief is part of the problem, because collapse rarely announces itself. The historian Joseph Tainter studied this pattern across dozens of fallen societies, and he found something the popular story about Rome always leaves out. Societies don't usually collapse because a single disaster hits them. They collapse because the cost of keeping everything running quietly outgrows what the society can afford. Tainter called this declining marginal returns on complexity. In plain English, every new problem needs a bigger, more expensive fix than the last one, until the fixes themselves become the burden. Picture what that actually meant for you, a taxpayer in the Western Roman Empire in the 4th century. Rome's borders stretch across 3 continents. Defending them means paying soldiers, and soldiers are expensive. So taxes rise. Rising taxes push small farmers toward debt. Debt pushes them off their land and into dependence on wealthy landlords. Fewer independent farmers means a smaller tax base. A smaller tax base means the empire has to squeeze harder just to stand still. Do you see the loop? The machine that was supposed to protect you is quietly consuming the thing it depends on. The classicist Harper adds another layer that most people never hear about, because it doesn't fit the neat story of moral decline or barbarian invasion. Harper studied ice cores and tree rings, records that hold a climate history far more precise than any Roman scribe ever wrote. What he found was a period of unusual warmth and stability, now called the Roman climate optimum, that had quietly powered the empire's growth for centuries. Then, starting in the 3rd century, that stability broke down. Harper's research points to volcanic eruptions and cooling that hit right as a new pathogen emerged. One his work links to the pandemic historians now call the plague of Cyprian. Poor harvests, emptied garrisons, understaffed farms, all while the tax demands stayed the same or grew. You didn't vote for any of this. You just watched your grain price double in a single bad season, and nobody in power could tell you why. So picture the final harvest before your town's granary runs dry for the first time in living memory. The overseer walks the rows counting stalks that should be twice as tall. Your neighbor sells half his tools to buy seed grain he probably won't be able to plant in time. Down the road, a Roman tax collector arrives on schedule, because the schedule does not know that the harvest failed. He takes what the law says he's owed. What's left has to feed your family until spring. This is what economic historians mean by systemic fragility. Not one crisis. A system with no slack left in it, so that any shock, a bad harvest, a disease, a lost battle, lands directly on people who had nothing left to give. Here's the twist almost nobody expects. The Western Roman Empire didn't fall in a single dramatic year. The historian Bryan Ward-Perkins has argued the collapse unfolded across roughly 2 full centuries, not one apocalyptic evening. Cities shrank gradually. Trade networks thinned out gradually. Literacy narrowed gradually. Long-distance pottery, cheap and mass-produced under Roman trade, vanished from the archaeological records so completely that Ward-Perkins points to it as one of the clearest signs of just how much ordinary daily life quietly lost, generation by generation, long before anyone wrote the word fall. You didn't experience an ending. You experienced a slow subtraction. Fewer coins in circulation. Fewer skilled builders passing down their trade. A road that used to get repaired every few years that 1 year just doesn't. And here is the part that should unsettle you most. The people living through it mostly didn't know they were living through a collapse. They knew things were harder than they used to be. They knew taxes felt unfair. They knew the roads were rougher and the markets thinner. But there was no headline, no single moment where a person could point and say, "This is the day Rome fell." The ending was made of 1,000 ordinary Tuesdays that quietly got a little worse than the Tuesday before. Does that sound familiar? Think about the systems your life depends on right now. The power grid, the water treatment plant, the supply chains that keep grocery shelves full without you ever thinking about it. Modern researchers studying infrastructure resilience use language that would feel completely at home in Tainter's work: aging systems, rising maintenance costs, diminishing returns on new investment. Every fix costs more than the last one. Every year of deferred maintenance quietly borrows against a future that has to pay it back with interest. You are not being asked to panic. You are being asked to notice. Because the warning signs in Rome were never secret. They were visible the entire time, to anyone who looked. Rising taxes on a shrinking base. Declining birth rates among small landholders. A currency that got debased, again and again, until people no longer trusted its face value. Officials who kept insisting the situation was under control, right up until it plainly wasn't. None of that required a prophecy. It required attention and a willingness to act on what the numbers were already showing. So think about your own granaries. Not literal grain, but the buffers that make your life absorb a shock instead of breaking under one. Savings, skills, relationships you can actually call on, infrastructure that gets maintained instead of merely used. Rome's tragedy wasn't that its people were foolish. It's that the cost of ignoring slow warning signs was invisible until it was overwhelming, and by then, the empire had spent centuries removing its own margin for error. Let's go back to that farmer selling his tools for seed grain. What happens to him next matters more than most retellings of Rome ever admit. He doesn't disappear. He doesn't die in some dramatic last stand. He signs himself and his family into the protection of a wealthy landowner nearby, trading his independence for security. Historians call this process the growth of the late Roman patronage system, and you can think of it simply as small people trading freedom for safety once the state can no longer guarantee either. Multiply that single farmer by hundreds of thousands, across 2 centuries, and you start to see how an empire can hollow out from the inside while its monuments are still standing. Now widen the frame. The archaeologist Bryan Ward-Perkins doesn't just point to vanishing pottery. He points to something almost invisible unless you know to look for it. The disappearance of tiled roofs in the British countryside after Roman administration withdrew. For generations, ordinary farmhouses across Roman Britain had proper fired tile roofs, a small but telling sign of a functioning economy that could produce, transport, and sell manufactured goods cheaply. After the withdrawal, that tile vanishes from the archaeological layer almost completely. People go back to thatch, not because anyone forgot how to make tile, because the economic network that made tile making, tile selling, and tile buying possible had simply stopped existing. Think about what that means for you. It's not that the knowledge disappeared, it's that the system holding thousands of small specializations together, the trade routes, the currency people trusted, the demand that made specialization worthwhile, quietly unraveled. A blacksmith with no customers stops being a blacksmith. A potter with no market stops training an apprentice. Skills don't vanish in a single generation. They vanish because nobody could afford to practice them anymore, and then, 1 generation later, nobody remembers how. Here's where the plague deserves a closer look, because it's usually reduced to a footnote. Kyle Harper's research into the so-called plague of Cyprian, likely a viral hemorrhagic fever based on the described symptoms, estimates it may have killed a significant share of the population across the empire in the mid-3rd century. Picture entire garrisons along the Rhine and Danube frontiers reduced to a fraction of their strength within a single season. Picture the emperor of the moment trying to recruit soldiers from a population that has just been devastated, while enemies on the border have noticed the empire suddenly looks thinner than it used to. This is the point where a system with no slack starts making desperate decisions. Emperors debase the silver coinage, mixing in cheaper metal to stretch the treasury further. At first it works. Then people notice their coins buy less bread than they used to. Merchants start pricing goods in gold instead of the debased silver denarius, because gold, unlike silver mixed with copper, cannot be quietly watered down by an emperor in a hurry. Trust in the currency erodes exactly the way trust in an institution erodes. Slowly, then all at once, when enough people privately agree it's no longer worth what it claims to be. You would have felt this directly as a shopkeeper or a farmer. 1 year, your coins buy what they always bought. 2 years, your coins buy what they always bought. 3 years, your coins buy what they always bought. 4 years, your coins buy what they always bought. 5 years, your coins buy what they always bought. 6 years, your coins buy what they always bought. 7 years, your coins buy what they always bought. 8 years, your coins buy what they always bought. 9 years, your coins buy what they always bought. 10 years, your coins buy what they always bought. 11 years, your coins buy what they always bought. 12 years, your coins buy what they always bought. 13 years, your coins buy what they always bought. 14 years, your coins buy what they always bought. 15 years, your coins buy what they always bought. 16 years, your coins buy what they always bought. 17 years, your coins buy what they always bought. 18 years, your coins buy what they always bought. 19 years, your coins buy what A few years later, the same coins buy noticeably less, and nobody in charge can explain why with a straight face. That is currency debasement, and it is one of the oldest, most reliable early warning signs of a government trying to spend money it doesn't actually have. Now picture the council scene, because it happened again and again across the 3rd and 4th centuries. A handful of officials gather around a map showing which frontier province needs reinforcement most urgently this year, knowing full well there aren't enough soldiers or enough gold to cover every threatened border at once. They choose. They always have to choose. And every choice to reinforce one frontier is, quietly, a choice to leave another one thinner than it should be. This is what historians mean when they say the fall of the Western Roman Empire wasn't caused by any single barbarian group. The Visigoths, the Vandals, the Huns pushing other groups westward, none of them were strong enough on their own to topple an empire at the height of its power. What they exploited was an empire that had already spent 2 centuries quietly running out of margin. When the Visigoths under Alaric sacked Rome in 410, it shocked the Mediterranean world precisely because the city hadn't fallen to a foreign army in 800 years. But by then, Rome, the political capital, had already been eclipsed for decades by Ravenna and Milan, cities better positioned for the frontier wars the empire could no longer avoid. The sack of Rome was a symbol. The actual collapse had been happening for generations already, in tax rolls and abandoned farms and thinning garrisons that never made it into anyone's dramatic retelling. So when did people finally admit it was over? That's the counterintuitive part. Many of them never got the chance to, because there was no single moment. The last Western emperor, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus, was quietly deposed in 476 by a Germanic general who simply decided the position of Western emperor wasn't worth maintaining anymore. Contemporaries barely commented on it. Administrators in the East kept functioning as though nothing world historical had happened, because from where they stood, in many ways, nothing had. The Eastern Roman Empire, what we now call the Byzantine Empire, continued for another 1,000 years. The fall wasn't an ending. It was an uneven fade, faster in some provinces, barely noticeable in others, for an audience that mostly didn't know they were watching the finale. Does that sound familiar? Look at the systems your own life depends on. The transformers that keep your regional power grid running are, in many places, decades past their intended service life, and the researchers who study infrastructure resilience talk about exactly the pattern Joseph Tainter described in ancient societies: aging systems, rising maintenance costs, and diminishing returns on every new patch. Supply chains that look robust because shelves are full today can be thinner and more fragile than they appear, the same way Roman trade networks looked permanent right up until they weren't. You are not being asked to panic. You are being asked to notice. Because the warning signs in Rome were never secret. They were visible the entire time, to anyone willing to look past the monuments. Rising taxes on a shrinking base of small landholders. A currency debased until people stopped trusting its face value. Officials making frontier trade-offs they knew were inadequate year after year, because there was never enough left to do otherwise. None of that required a prophecy. It required attention and a willingness to act on what the numbers were already showing, long before the crisis became undeniable. So think about your own granaries. Not literal grain, but the buffers that let your life absorb a shock instead of breaking under one. Savings, skills that don't depend on a single fragile system. Relationships you can actually call on. Infrastructure that gets properly maintained instead of merely used until it fails. Rome's tragedy wasn't that its people were foolish. It's that the cost of ignoring slow warning signs stayed invisible for 2 centuries, right up until it was overwhelming, and by then, the empire had already spent that margin down to nothing. You still pay your taxes. The roads are still paved for now. The grain ships still arrive, for now. And somewhere, someone is deciding that's reason enough not to worry. History suggests otherwise.